On a Wednesday morning in the third week of March 2003, Elspeth Cairn stood at the window of Cairn & Son Agricultural Services on the main road through Carleton Place, Ontario, and watched a truck she recognized pull out of her gravel lot and turn south toward Perth without stopping. The truck belonged to the Viancourt operation out of Beckwith Township, 300 acres of mixed grain and cash crop, and the man driving it had been her customer for 11 years. She knew where he was going. He was going to the new co-op service center that had opened the previous fall on the edge of Smiths Falls, the one with the glass-fronted office and the computerized diagnostic equipment and the service bays wide enough to take a combine header without disassembling it first. She'd heard about it the way you hear about things in Lanark County, not from anyone who told her directly, but from the accumulation of small signs that add up to something you already knew before anyone said it out loud. That was the spring of 2003, and if you know anything about what was happening to small independent agricultural service operations in eastern Ontario in those years, you already understand the shape of what Elspeth was facing. The consolidation had been coming for a long time. The big equipment dealers were expanding their service networks. The co-ops were building regional centers that could offer a parts inventory and a diagnostic system that no single shop operation in a town of 8,000 people could reasonably compete with. The farms themselves were getting bigger, which meant the equipment was getting bigger, and bigger equipment had requirements that a shop built in 1967 by a man who'd learned his trade on Massey Harris machines was not always set up to meet. Elspeth Cairn was 53 years old that March, and she had been in the agricultural service business for her entire working life. She'd started at 14 doing inventory on weekends for her father, Gordon Cairn, who had opened the shop in 1967 after 15 years as a mechanic at a dealer in Ottawa. She'd learned to read a wiring diagram at 16. She could diagnose a hydraulic fault by sound by the time she was 20, a skill her father said was rarer than people thought and more valuable than it looked. She'd taken over the business formally when Gordon's arthritis made it impossible for him to work the shop floor anymore in 1994, and she'd kept the name because her father had built it, and because changing it would have cost money she didn't have, and because, frankly, the name still meant something in the county to people who were old enough to remember what it had meant. She did repairs and parts and seasonal service contracts, and she had 2 mechanics, a man named Bud who had been with her for 12 years, and a younger man named Travis who was good with electronics, which mattered more every year as the equipment got more complex. She had a parts counter run by a woman named Deb, who had grown up on a farm near Almonte and knew the difference between what a farmer said he needed and what he actually needed, which is a distinction that matters more than most people outside the industry understand. In March of 2003, she was looking at a spring season that was quieter than any she'd seen since the early 90s, and she was doing the arithmetic that she'd been putting off for 3 weeks, and the arithmetic was not saying anything she wanted to hear. Let me tell you about what March means to an agricultural service shop in eastern Ontario, 'cause it matters for what comes next. By the third week of March, the ground is still frozen in most of Lanark County. But the farmers are not. The planters are being pulled out of sheds and taken apart and inspected. The seeders are being gone over. The tractors that have been sitting since November are being started up and checked out before the season begins, because the season begins whether you're ready or not, and the cost of not being ready is measured in acres per day. A good agricultural service shop in March should have its bays full of preseason work, its phone going steadily, and a backlog that would run 3 weeks into April. Elspeth had 2 machines in the shop that morning. She had a tractor that belonged to her, and that she was working on herself because Bud and Travis didn't have enough to do, and she wasn't going to pay them to watch her be worried. She'd lost the accounts quietly and incrementally, the way you lose things that you don't notice leaving until they're gone. The Viancourts had been the most recent. Before them, 2 seasons ago, the Osbaldiston family from Drummond Township, who had signed a service agreement with the Smiths Falls Co-op the previous fall. Before that, the Henneberry operation from south of Carlton Place, 400 acres, who had moved their business to a dealer in Kanata because their new equipment came with a warranty that required dealer service. She had not lost them because her work was careless or her pricing was dishonest. She had lost them the way the small things always lose to the large things, not through any single failure, but through the accumulation of factors that had nothing to do with quality and everything to do with scale. She had made calls. She had driven out to farms. She had put together a loyalty pricing structure for long-time customers that her accountant had described, not unkindly, as optimistic. She had invested in a new diagnostic reader the previous year because Travis had told her they needed it, and they had needed it. But it had not brought back the accounts she'd already lost, and it had cost her more than she was comfortable admitting to anyone, including herself. Standing at the window watching the Vaillancourt truck disappear south, she did the calculation she'd been avoiding. The calculation said she had one good season, maybe, before she'd have to have a conversation with Bud and Travis that she did not want to have. That was when the calls started coming in, and I want you to understand that when they started, they did not look like rescue. They looked, at first, like ordinary business. The kind of ordinary business that reminds you how much you've been missing it. The first call came on a Friday from a woman named Fern LeClaire, who farmed 220 acres near Pakenham with her husband. Their cedar had a blockage problem in 3 of the openers that they couldn't clear, and they'd called the co-op in Smiths Falls and been told the earliest available appointment was 10 days out. Fern LeClaire had gotten Elspeth's number from a neighbor. Elspeth told her to bring it in. Travis cleared the blockages and found a worn bearing that was about to fail, caught it before it became a bigger problem, and had the cedar back out by the following Tuesday. Fern LeClaire paid her bill without discussion and said she'd be back. The second call came the same afternoon from a man named Lloyd Tanner, who ran a cash crop operation north of Lanark Village. He had a planter monitor that was giving false readings on 2 rows, and the diagnostic reader at the co-op had told him the sensor board needed replacing, which would have been $400 in parts alone. Travis looked at it and found a corroded connector that cleaned up in 20 minutes. Lloyd Tanner paid for an hour of labor. He shook Elspeth's hand and told her the co-op had quoted him the part without even pulling the connector. She didn't say anything about that. There was nothing useful to say. The third call came Monday morning, then 2 more on Tuesday. Let me tell you what was happening, because Elspeth didn't fully understand it until Deb explained it to her while they were both staying late one Thursday to sort through a backlog of parts orders that had materialized out of a spring season that 3 weeks earlier had looked nearly empty. What was happening was not complicated, though like most things that aren't complicated, you couldn't see it clearly until you were standing in the right place to look at it. The Smiths Falls Co-op Center had a larger facility and a deeper parts inventory and a computerized diagnostic system, and they had signed service agreements with the biggest operations in the region, agreements that guaranteed those operations priority booking and preferred rates and a level of service that justified the volume commitment. Those agreements had filled the co-op's bays for the spring season before the season started. When smaller operations and owner-operators started calling in March With the problems that always come up in March, the co-op was already committed. They were booking 2 weeks out. They were telling people to wait or to try elsewhere, and the people they were telling to try elsewhere were calling Cairn and Son, because Cairn and Son had availability, and because Gordon Cairn's name still meant something to the people who were old enough to have had their equipment fixed by him, and those people had children and neighbors who farmed, and word travels in Lanark County the way water moves in limestone country, which is to say quietly, underground, and faster than you'd expect. But here is where Elspeth Cairn's story changes direction. And here is where I need to tell you about something that had been sitting in the back of her shop for 9 years without anyone asking about it, and without Elspeth being entirely sure herself why she'd kept it. Let me tell you about the bench at the back of Cairn and Son, because the people who noticed it when they came in either didn't say anything or said the wrong thing, and the people who didn't notice it walked right past it, and in the spring of 2003, it turned out to matter more than anything else in the building. Gordon Cairn had been a man who kept things, not in the way of a person who can't throw anything away, but in the way of a person who understood that the usefulness of a tool is not fixed at the moment of its manufacture, and does not expire at the moment the industry decides it's obsolete. The back section of the shop, beyond the parts shelving and the tool chest and the welding station, held a collection of instruments and reference materials that Elspeth had inherited, along with the business and the building and the name. There was a full set of printed service manuals, not digital, not scanned, not available online in any complete form, but the original printed factory manuals for every major piece of equipment the shop had serviced since 1967. They were organized by make and model in a system Gordon had developed himself, annotated in his handwriting in the margins, cross-referenced in a card file that Elspeth had never had the heart to digitize, because the annotations were the point. They were not just the published procedure. They were 30 years of Gordon's experience with what the published procedure left out. There was a calibration bench that Gordon had built himself in the late 70s from a design he'd adapted from something he'd seen at an agricultural college in Guelph, used for calibrating cedar metering mechanisms, the kind of precise mechanical calibration that told you not just whether a cedar was working, but whether it was working accurately at the level of seed count per row per pass, which is the difference between a cedar that plants and a cedar that plants correctly. The big diagnostic computers could tell you if a sensor was reading. They could not tell you what the sensor was reading was true. There was a voltage and resistance testing kit that Gordon had assembled himself from components he'd bought from an electronic supplier in Ottawa in 1981, back when the first generation of electronic control systems were appearing on agricultural equipment, and nobody in the independent service business had a reliable way to test them. It was not sophisticated by any standard that anyone in 2003 would have recognized. It was, however, precise in ways that the newer diagnostic readers were not, because Gordon had calibrated it himself by hand against known standards, and because Elspeth had maintained that calibration every year, not because she expected to need it, but because her father had taught her that a tool you don't maintain is a tool you don't have when you need it. Most of the farmers who came into the shop that Spring walked through without looking at the back bench, the ones who looked at it sometimes smiled, the way people smile at something that connects them to an earlier version of the world. A few of them mentioned recognizing a manual from a machine their fathers had run. Elspeth would tell them about Gordon, and they'd nod and move on. But in the second week of April, a man named Stuart Findlay drove in from his farm east of Mississippi Mills with a seeding problem that the co-op system had failed twice to diagnose correctly, and he stopped at the back bench and did not smile. He stood there for a long time with the expression of a man who is looking at a possible solution to a problem he had been told had no solution. Let me tell you about Stuart Findlay, because you need to understand him before you can understand what came next. Stuart was 61 years old and had farmed the same ground his father had cleared outside Appleton since 1952. He ran a mixed operation, about 450 acres, grain and forage, and a small beef herd that he kept because his father had kept one and because he liked cattle in the way that some people like things that are difficult and honest. He used equipment that was functional rather than current. He bought new when he had to, and maintained what he had with a thoroughness that Elspeth had always respected, because thorough maintenance is not a personality trait, it's a form of intelligence applied to the physical world. Stuart's problem was his air seeder. He had a large frame air seeder that he'd bought used 8 years earlier and maintained well, and it had started showing a distribution problem. 2 of his field sections were coming in consistently thin, not dramatically thin, not the kind of thin that stops you cold, but thin enough over enough acres that it was showing up in his yield records and costing him in a way that added up to real money over multiple seasons. He'd had the co-op look at it twice. The first time they'd replaced a distribution head. The problem persisted. The second time they'd told him the monitor readings were within acceptable range and suggested the issue might be soil variability. Stuart Findlay had been farming those fields for 40 years. He knew the soil. The issue was not soil variability. He'd come to Elspeth because a neighbor had told him she'd fixed Lloyd Tanner's planter monitor when the co-op had missed the diagnosis. He wasn't sure what she could do differently. He was out of other options, and he was the kind of man who keeps trying until something works, not out of optimism, but out of stubbornness, which in farming is a more reliable quality than optimism. Elspeth looked at the seeder. Travis ran the diagnostic reader over it. The readings came back within acceptable range, same as the co-op had found. Elspeth went to the back bench. Let me tell you about the next 2 days, because they are the reason that Cairn and Son is still operating today, still on the same road through Carlton Place, and the reason there is a framed photograph in the waiting area that every person who comes in for the first time eventually asks about. The calibration bench that Gordon Cairn had built in the late 70s was not designed for the Stuart Findlay had brought in. It had been designed for an earlier generation of equipment. But the principle it operated on was not generational. The principle was mechanical, and it did not change because the equipment changed. The principle was that distribution accuracy in an air seeder depends on the metering mechanism turning at a rate that is precisely and consistently related to the speed of the machine across the ground, and that this relationship, which is what the monitor is supposed to measure, can only be verified against a physical standard, not against another electronic reading. Elspeth used the calibration bench to run a mechanical check on the metering drive system, not the sensor, the drive itself. What she found was a worn coupler in the drivetrain of one of the 2 affected sections, a mechanical wear issue that was intermittent rather than constant, which is why it hadn't shown on the sensor readings. The sensor was reading the drive correctly most of the time. Some of the time, under load and vibration in field conditions, the worn coupler was slipping, and when it slipped, the section was underseeding. Not dramatically, not constantly, but repeatedly under the specific conditions of field operation in a pattern that added up over 400 acres to exactly the kind of yield variation that Stuart Findlay had been recording in his field notes for 3 seasons. The coupler cost $40. The labor to replace it was 2 hours. The calibration check to confirm the repair was another hour. Elspeth showed Stuart the worn part and explained what it had been doing. He stood at the bench and looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, 3 years. She knew what he meant. He'd been losing yield for 3 years to a $40 part that 2 diagnostic passes had missed, because both of them had been reading sensors rather than verifying mechanics. He asked her where she'd learned to check it that way. She told him about the calibration bench, about her father, about the principle Gordon had explained to her when she was young, that a sensor tells you what the sensor measures, and a sensor is only as useful as your understanding of what it can and cannot measure, and that there are things in mechanical systems that sensors are not designed to detect, and those are exactly the things you have to be able to find by other means. Stuart Findlay went back to his farm and seeded his fields. His distribution came in, even across all sections, for the first time in 3 years. He called Elspeth 3 weeks later to tell her his seedbed was the most consistent he'd seen in a decade. He also told his neighbor, and his neighbor told 2 other people. And one of those people had a cousin who farmed near Balderson, who had been having a problem with a planter that nobody had been able to explain. Let me tell you about what that spring became, because it became something that Elspeth had not planned for and could not have predicted, and it began from a bench in the back of her shop that most people walked past without looking at it. The calls came in the way. Calls come in when word is moving through a rural community with genuine urgency behind it. Not a flood, but a steady current. A farmer from north of Perth with a metering issue on an older grain drill. A woman from west of Carlton Place whose cedar monitor had been replaced twice and was still reading inconsistently. A father and his 2 adult sons from near Lanark Village who had bought a used air cart and couldn't get the calibration to hold, and had been told by 2 different shops that the problem was the monitor system. The problem was not the monitor system. The problem, in the case of the air cart, was a worn drive component that was intermittently slipping under load, which is exactly what you would find if you check the mechanics rather than rereading the sensors. Elspeth found it in an afternoon. She fixed it the next morning. Each time she found something that the electronic diagnostic had missed, she explained to the farmer what she'd done, and why in the same terms her father had used with her. Not to be instructive, not to make a point about old methods versus new ones, because she thought farmers deserved to understand their equipment, and because a farmer who understands what went wrong is a farmer who can describe the next problem accurately, and a farmer who can describe the next problem accurately is a farmer you can actually help. The explanation mattered. The farmers talked about it afterward, not just about the repair, but about the explanation. About Elspeth taking them to the back bench and showing them the worn part and explaining the mechanical principle. About feeling like someone had finally answered the question rather than just replaced a component and hoped. And then, in the last week of April, a man named Robert Beaumont drove out from the Smiths Falls Co-op to look at a belt drive cedar that a customer had brought to Elspeth because the co-op was still 2 weeks out on bookings. He stood in the shop and watched her work the calibration bench. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "How long have you been doing it that way?" Elspeth told him about Gordon, about the bench. About 1979, Robert Beaumont said, "We've had 3 customers this spring with distribution problems we couldn't pin down. 2 of them we sent home and told them to run a season and document the variation and come back to us." He paused. "One of them was going to pull the whole metering system." Elspeth looked at him. He said, "Can I send them to you?" She said yes. Robert Beaumont was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know we've been pulling accounts from this shop for 4 years." Elspeth said, "I know. Send them anyway." He sent them. All three came to Cairn and Son within the week. Two of them had additional service work that Bud and Travis handled alongside the calibration diagnostic. One of them became a regular customer and has been one ever since. Let me tell you about what happened to Cairn and Son over the following 2 seasons, because what happened was not dramatic in the way that dramatic things usually are. It did not happen fast. It did not look, from the outside, like a rescue or a turnaround. It looked like a shop that was doing good work and developing a specific reputation for a specific kind of problem. But that specific reputation was exactly the right reputation to have in a county full of farmers who were running complex equipment with sophisticated sensor systems that could tell you a great deal about what the equipment thought it was doing and very little about whether what the equipment thought it was doing was correct. Elspeth had not invented the calibration method or the diagnostic principle. Gordon had adapted it from work he'd encountered at the agricultural college in Guelph in the late 60s. What Elspeth had done was maintain it. Keep the bench calibrated. Keep the knowledge current. Keep the manuals complete and annotated and accessible to herself and to Travis and to Bud. Not because anyone had told her to, not because there was obvious business value in maintaining a service approach that the rest of the industry had moved away from, but because her father had taught her that the value of a diagnostic method is not determined by how many people are using it. It's determined by whether it finds what you're looking for. The spring season of 2003 led to a summer of steady work. The summer led to a fall of new preseason bookings for the following spring. The LeClaire family came back. Lloyd Tanner came back and brought 2 of his neighbors. Stuart Findlay sent 3 people to Elspeth in the following spring with the specific instruction to have her run the calibration check before anything else. Travis learned the calibration method that summer, watching Elspeth, asking questions the way a person asks questions when they understand that what they're watching is worth understanding. He didn't have access to what Elspeth had. He didn't have Gordon's annotated manuals or 30 years of accumulated context, but he had the principle. And once you have the principle, the rest is practice. Let me tell you about what Elspeth told her daughter Maureen, because Maureen is the one who manages the business side of the shop now, and Maureen is the one who keeps the photograph in the waiting area. Gordon Cairn was 24 in 2003, working in Ottawa and not thinking about coming back to Carleton Place and not thinking about the shop except when she came home for holidays and saw how tired her mother looked. She came back in 2007 for reasons that had nothing to do with the shop and found that the shop had changed in ways she hadn't expected. It was busy. Not just surviving, but actually busy, with a reputation that had spread well past Lanark County into Renfrew and east into Frontenac. A reputation built on a specific thing that a specific set of farmers understood and valued and told each other about. She asked her mother what had changed. Elspeth took her to the back bench and showed her the calibration setup and the manuals and explained the principle the same way she'd explained it to Stuart Findlay and the 3 farmers Robert Beaumont had sent her, and every farmer since who had asked how she'd found what the diagnostic computer had missed. Maureen has repeated what her mother said in various forms over the years to various people, and it goes roughly like this. She said, "The computer reads what the sensor reads. The sensor reads what it's designed to measure. The design of what it measures is based on assumptions about what the most common problem is. When the problem is a common problem, the system finds it. When the problem is not a common problem, the system tells you everything is fine, and you believe it. Because the system is very expensive and very sophisticated, and it is very convincing when it tells you nothing is wrong. The bench doesn't make assumptions. The bench checks what's actually happening. That's not a better machine. It's a different question. Your job is to know when you're asking the wrong question. Maureen was 28 when she first heard this. She didn't entirely follow it then. She followed it better at 35 when she'd been in the shop long enough to see the pattern repeat. She follows it completely now. She has kept the calibration bench calibrated the way her mother kept it, and the way Gordon calibrated it before that. She has kept the manuals, Gordon's annotations intact and supplemented now with her own notes and with Travis's in a different ink. She has added to the reference collection at the back of the shop, not replacing the old material, but building on it, because that is what the principle requires. The photograph on the wall of the waiting area shows Elspeth Cairn standing at the calibration bench in the back of the shop, probably 2004 or 2005, in her work jacket with a worn drive coupler sitting on the bench in front of her. She is not looking at the camera. She is looking at the part the way a person looks at something that has just told them the truth. People who come into the shop for the first time ask about it sometimes. Maureen tells them about Gordon's bench and Stuart Findlay's cedar and the spring of 2003. She tells it the way her mother told it to her, not as a story about old methods beating new technology, because that is not what it is. She tells it as a story about knowing what your tools can and cannot measure, and about the fact that the most sophisticated system available is only as useful as your understanding of what it is and isn't designed to find. The calibration bench is still at the back of the shop. Maureen keeps it the way her mother kept it and the way Gordon built it. It doesn't get used every week. The equipment has changed and the diagnostics have gotten better, and a lot of the problems that would have stumped an electronic reader 20 years ago don't stump one today. But some of them still do. Every spring, when the preseason work comes in and the planters and seeders start coming through the bays, there are a handful of machines that the diagnostic reader looks at and tells you are fine and that are not fine, and that are losing a farmer yield in ways they can see in their records but cannot explain. Those machines go to the back bench. The bench finds what it's looking for. It does this every time. 2 springs ago, a young farmer named Tyler Findlay drove in from east of Mississippi Mills. He was Stuart's grandson, farming some of the same ground, running more acres with newer equipment. He had a distribution problem on his air seeder that 2 shops had looked at and not found. Someone had told him to come to Cairn and Son. He didn't know why. Specifically, he just knew someone had told him that if they can't find it anywhere else, you try Carlton Place. Maureen listened to him describe the problem. She took him to the back bench and explained what she was going to check and why. He watched her work. She found a worn coupler in the metering drive, intermittent slip under load, $45 in parts. Tyler Findlay stood at the bench and looked at the part for a long moment. Then he said, "My grandfather told me about this place." Maureen said, "What did he tell you?" he said. He said they fixed something once that 2 other shops was fixed. He said they found it on an old bench that looked like it belonged in a museum. Maureen smiled. She said, "It did belong in a museum. It just turned out to be more useful here." Tyler Findlay paid his bill and shook her hand and drove back to Mississippi Mills. And Maureen went back into the shop and looked at the photograph for a moment before she went back to the bench. Cairn and Son Agricultural Services is still on the main road through Carlton Place. The sign is newer than the one Gordon painted, but it has the same name. The diagnostic equipment has been updated twice since 2003. The mechanics have changed. The customers are a different generation than the ones who first knew Gordon Cairn. But in the back of the shop, past the tool chest and the welding station, the calibration bench still stands where Gordon built it, annotated and maintained and ready. Every spring, the calls come in from farmers who have run out of electronic answers and are ready to try a different question. Maureen picks up the phone. She knows what they need before they finish describing it. She learned it from her mother, who learned it from her father, and the knowing goes back further than that. Back to a man in Guelph who understood something about the limits of what any measurement system can measure. And back further still, to the older and more durable truth that the tool that finds the problem is not always the tool that everyone is using. Sometimes it's the one that's been sitting in the back corner, calibrated and ready, waiting for the morning when the new answers run out and someone thinks to ask about the bench.